Thanks again for joining the Center on Global Energy Policy and BeyondNetZero this evening for this special conversation as part of Climate Week NYC. My name is Jason Bordoff. I direct the Center on Global Energy Policy and co-lead the Columbia University Climate School. Really delighted to have all of you here and this great group of experts on this panel and the next one to discuss this incredibly important topic, how we're going to mobilize capital for the energy transition in some of the world's developing and emerging economies. Let me quickly say that this event is being webcast live. The full video will be available online in the coming days. For those of you joining us via Zoom, you can submit a question for the panelists at any time by clicking on the Q&A button on your screen. As a reminder, our events are closed captioned. You can turn the captions on by clicking the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen and then selecting show subtitles. And finally, for those of you all here in person, here in Faculty House at Columbia, we welcome you to join us for a cocktail reception immediately following the program. I think it's just one flight up, and we hope to see you all there. I'll just say quickly, this topic, mobilize, how to think about the combination of meeting the world's energy needs, how much energy it takes, not just for energy access, but energy for prosperity, energy for meaningful levels of economic growth, even just a fraction of the standard of living we all take for granted sitting in most of the cities where we are, and how you reconcile that, how big those numbers are with the challenge of net zero by 2050 of a target like 1.5 degrees Celsius is a major priority for the work we do at all aspects of Columbia, at the Center on Global Energy Policy, at the Columbia Climate School, and many other parts of Columbia University. And we need so much capital, as you will hear in a moment, that has to go into the energy transition, somewhere in the order of $3 trillion a year. You can pick your estimates, they vary, but not 100 billion, which, by the way, that pledge from developed to developing economies has not even yet been fulfilled, even if it were, it's a rounding error compared to the roughly $1 to $2 trillion of capital that has to go into investment in energy, clean energy, in the developing economies and the emerging markets. Huge priority, a huge challenge, and urgently necessary if we're going to meet the challenges both of providing increasing prosperity levels to people around the world and to dealing with the challenge of climate change. So that's the topic of our conversation today, and really the topic of one of our major priorities in all the work we do here. I'm going to turn it over now to my good friend, Catherine McKenna, who's chair of the UN's high-level expert group on net zero commitments, the former Canadian Environment and Climate Minister, as well as the Infrastructure Minister, and very luckily for all of us, a distinguished visiting fellow here at both the Center on Global Energy Policy and the Columbia Climate School. She's been a friend for many years, a true champion for climate action. She is wearing the t-shirt that I gave her, which she was taken with at the COP in Glasgow, and she wears proudly, stubborn climate optimist. And I can think of no one who better captures the spirit of that label than Minister McKenna. I'll turn it over to you.
Yes. Well, thank you very much, Jason. It's great you gave me a shirt, but do I get an electric bike by being associated with Columbia?
You've ridden on the back of it.
Just saying. Apologies for being late. It is brutal here in Climate Week. I'm sure everyone in New York is like, could these people all go home? But I'm very happy to be here, and of course, very happy to see so many students here tonight, because I know how much you care about climate action, and you're always wondering, are we going to get it right? It's also a lot of faculty and folks I know from my previous life, including you, Jason. So we have a really great panel. We don't have a ton of time. And so without further ado, we'll get into it. We have Tarier Badageson. Sorry, I did it probably not an amazing job, but I tried. Managing Director and CEO of Amharath Infrastructure Fund. And then Lord John Brown, co-founder and chairman from BeyondNetZero. I'm very interested in this topic because I'm chairing the Secretary General's Net Zero group. It's ostensibly on action of non-state actors, commitments to net zero, but he's very concerned about greenwashing. But one of the things that is the focus of our is money. How do we get the billions to trillions to flow? And what's great about our group is we actually have members from the global south. We have members from Africa, members from Asia, members from South America. And what they say to me is they actually want to see ambitious climate action, that they know that there's an opportunity to move, to phase out coal, to get off oil and gas, but of course they need electricity. I lived in Indonesia, but they want to see the scale of finance that is needed, and it's $3 trillion, and that money is not flowing. So I think that's really the challenge before us. Two things need to happen on climate change. I say, like, there's all these things. Everyone's like, it's so complicated. Guess what has to happen? One, emissions need to go down. That's just a thing. If we're going to tackle climate change, and the way to do that is money is going to have to go from status quo to clean at scale. All of this at scale, like right now. So we have experts here who are going to help us talk about this. So let's just start with a really easy question. And both of you are experts. You know all about mobilizing capital. And instead of talking about you can talk about the problems, but we need solutions, because I spend a lot of time and everyone's like, it's so hard. I'm like, oh, hard things are hard. But we need to figure out, how do we get scale on mobilizing climate finance? Of course, that means, we need to be focused on making sure people have access to electricity and large scale infrastructure. But how do we actually get this money flowing? What are the barriers, but what is the way we're actually going to get through these barriers? So Terry, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think that
Sure. So let's start climbing the mountain. I think the issue with climate finance, and just to give some context, ARM Harris is an infrastructure private equity fund. We're based in Lagos, and we invest in West Africa and Pan-African infrastructure. Been doing the heavy lift on trying to mobilize capital to infrastructure in the first instance. And now, as we're moving into climate action and sustainable infrastructure, our second fund is a climate fund focused on low carbon infrastructure, one of the few indigenous African-led funds in the space. And when you look at the landscape of capital, it's really important to look at it via the lens of government funding and private funding, because not all sectors and all projects are suitable for private sector funding. And at the same time, the government cannot finance all action on its own, and you actually need private capital. But I think, if you look at the challenges and the opportunities from both perspectives, from the government side of things, there's a huge need for bottom-up transition strategies. The energy transition is not going to be a one-size-fits-all. It has to be country specific, and it has to be sector specific that can actually double click down into projects and into what is actually the green pathway for the country. And so while there's been a lot of success with green bonds, sustainability bonds, for that to be scaled to developing economies, there really needs to be a lot more technical assistance and strategy around country strategies for climate action and what that means from an implementation standpoint. On the private sector side, this is a challenge we've faced in infrastructure, which is that the infrastructure challenge in Africa as an example is a case of the need to build infrastructure. We have a $170 billion infrastructure gap. We don't have operating infrastructure. So we need to be able to allocate capital to greenfield new investments. But the capital markets historically are not fit for purpose for greenfield infrastructure. It's actually set up for more of an operating cruise control infrastructure. And so there actually needs to be a funding methodology and system for new assets, for new forms of business models for these type of technologies. And you may find that existing financial models don't work, which means you need financial innovation. And that means that the usual investors, be it pension funds, be it in our world, the development finance community, are going to have to start thinking outside of the box and thinking too, right? But there's got to be a lot more flexibility with what type of capital, be it capital that's equity, blended finance, all kinds of risk mitigation. And while it's complicated, it's only complicated because it's new. And the more we do it, I think the easier it's going to get.
Well, I think that is very positive, and you have the real experience on the ground, because sometimes I think When I talk to people, and Jason and I have sat in many blended finance conversations, you have the folks who have money and they're like, we have so much money. We have like, we are just money. We have money like to spend, but we can't find anything to spend it on. And then they point at the multilateral development banks and they say, it's your fault because you're not taking on risk.
Yeah.
And then they kind of point to the countries and say, if you only had all these projects just waiting for us, we just come. And it's funny because I was infrastructure minister in Canada, and this complaint is these projects are all bespoke. I was like, try doing infrastructure in Canada. Infrastructure is by nature bespoke. We can't have these, the development banks crowding out private capital. They do need to take risk. But the folks with money have to go in country, my view. So I'm maybe not supposed to do this as moderator, but they actually need to be in country working with people and helping to develop the projects and the capacity and really thinking outside the box, because that's the only way we're actually going to make it work. But you can test this because we're going to go to Lord Brown. So Lord Brown, you've probably been in many blended finance conversations and broader conversations about getting the money flowing. We've had no problem getting money flowing in oil and gas and coal, but why? Those are infrastructure. That's infrastructure money. Why is it so hard to get this money, this capital that's sitting there for the biggest economic opportunity, not of our generation, like ever, to clean infrastructure? Why is it so hard, and how do we bridge this gap?
So I think the question is, what is different between all the very large investments that have been made in energy in the past and the new investments today. And I think I must have, in one way or another, been involved in about $1 trillion worth personally. So I think the answer is this, in my mind at least. First, there's no clarity on the targets and measurements which are being used to justify an investment in a way which is satisfactory to lenders and equity investors. I think there's no understanding of when the completion actually takes place, what is being targeted, so that people can see what is the actual outcome. I think there are plenty of different interpretations of targets, and some have too many escape clauses to make it possible to have a project which is bankable. So I think we need to expand our thinking in this area and standardize more. It's a topic which has been talked about for a long time. We need to continue to push on this point. It is not just the financial side, it's the industrial side that needs to get these targets better and better. Secondly, I do think there are some escape clauses which worry me a lot. I think if you were in any other project, escape clauses like, well, we'll offset this, we'll offset that, unless you can bank these and guarantee it, unclear what you're doing. And thirdly, many projects will need a particular regime of incentives or taxation, or occasionally disincentives. And I think there were very interesting implications of the IRA here in the United States that say, this might send a signal about what is important and why these incentives are in place, in particular for things like carbon storage and energy storage. Very important changes. I think you see it elsewhere in the world. In the UK, contracts for difference, for example, are ways of enabling the future by not just giving people a subsidy, but by assuring the risk. So I think that's important. The final point I'd make is no one, I think, would do an investment which is a one-off in any country without thinking about what's the implication on the other bits of the energy system. The obvious one is, going to make lots of EVs without any increase in the capacity of the grid. So this would be what you might call a non-systems approach to the problem. I think you need a systems approach. And with these things, I think you will get the money flowing. Everyone's right. There's plenty of money. It just needs to go to the places where it'll get a return relative to the expectations of the holder of the finance.
So I'm going to I'm going to pass this on to Jason, who has thought about this, I know, a lot, but maybe we're going to dig a little deeper. So you have countries who said they
That's
want
a
to get
problem
off
for me.
cool. No, you're just at the
Yeah, yeah.
surface. Well, we're going to test you there. It's going to be like, and you have your exams here. You're like, okay, do I really know this or not? So we have countries that literally say we want to get off coal, and we know one of the most important things we need to do right now is get off coal. And so you're actually seeing some movement that the countries that you have them coming together with the different sources of capital, public and private, figuring out, you got to do a lot of work. As you said, you got to figure out the grid. You can't just like get off coal without thinking about what are your other sources. And the money really only comes when you get to clean on the renewable side. So how do we do this? And to the bankable projects, because I often hear about rates of return, what about, like, how are we going to think more creatively? Because it's going to be harder if we are going to do this energy transition, just expecting large rates of return and it's going to be easy I don't think is going to get us there. But I think you've thought a lot about this, so you're going to give us this magic sauce.
Well, if it was easy magic sauce, it would have been done already. So it's not easy, and there's obviously multiple layers to the answer to that question. And you've thought about this more than anyone, so you should weigh in on your own question too, and thought about what it looks like to move beyond coal in many parts of the world. Thinking, let me make a high level comment that I think is related to this, which is there's the cost of new projects, and there are still coal plants being built around the world. That's different than the cost of retiring existing infrastructure, and how to think about who bears that cost and what the financial incentives are and how long it takes for projects to pay back their investors. Where is that capital going to come from? So the challenge is like you can sort of do stylized techno-economic models and find that it would be cheaper to power economy X in this way rather than this way. There's no master planner who is deciding how to build that and what to retire and what to start up. There are individual investors. There's a really important role. We have a whole program at the center focused on state-owned enterprises and national oil companies. So thinking about the different incentives that state-owned enterprises have, I think in this context is quite important. There are roles certainly for the DFIs. We're going to hear from Jake Levine on the next panel from the Development Finance Corporation for thinking about combination of equity and debt instruments for investment, for dealing with currency exchange risks. But all of that is part of the challenge of how something I've been writing a lot about is how jagged and messy and nonlinear this transition is going to be. And so I think the thing that we're struggling with now is not the end state. It is hard, but we know where we need to get to. It is the process of getting from here to there in a world where we're going to get things wrong. We're going to project how much power you can get from renewables, and that's not going to work out exactly the way we thought. We're going to have bumpiness along the way, and we're going to have to figure out how to smooth that volatility, which includes how to think about retiring large segments of the global coal fleet, which in Asia are average, 12, 13 years is the average age of the coal fleet. In the US, it's 45. So it's a lot easier to retire infrastructure. And then, of course, we need to remember that electricity is about 20% of final global energy consumption. And so we need to think about all the things outside of the power sector where some of the most rapid growth in emissions is coming from. And actually it's harder and often more costly with the green premium that Bill Gates has written about to drive those costs down. That's why I wrote a piece recently about how foreign policy was key to the success of the US Inflation Reduction Act, because in addition to what it can do in the US, how to think about the tools of development finance, the need to manage potential for trade risks, because there are some industrial policy, one might call protectionist measures in that bill. But also, if we can bring down the cost of expensive technologies for all the steel and cement that's used to build cities of millions of people every week in emerging and developing economies, it's going to make it more affordable. Not just for the US to decarbonize, but there are going to be ripple effects for other parts of the world because you need those substitutes. So coal has something to go to. Renewables can play a big role there, but not all of it.
Like, that's not bad, not a bad answer. No, so look, this topic is really tough. And so there's like the money angle at the highest level, like how do we get the large scale capital flowing? But there's also about people. And so in Canada, we announced we're phasing out coal. And I remember having a discussion with our finance minister at the time, and they said, well, I said, look, we need to figure out a just transition. What investments are we going to make for the people and communities? So, well, there's like, there's a lot of transitions going on. And I said, this isn't like disintermediation or something of the travel industry. I was like, we're literally phasing out jobs. So there is an obligation to figure out how we're going to support jobs and communities. And we tried. I mean, I think there's still a lot more work to do in Canada, but we went to communities. And I think it's always a reminder because we can talk to the abstract and finance. Sometimes I think we talk about here and like there's real people. And so these communities obviously want jobs. Well, people in those communities, actually, we had town halls. 800 people would come to a tiny auditorium. The only game in town was coal. So every job was related to coal directly or indirectly. And they were scared and they were angry. I don't think they were entirely surprised. What they were probably surprised was that anyone came and spoke to them from the government. But I think that's related to it. So when we think about transitions, I mean, how do we also think about the cost of the transition to support these communities and workers? And is there a responsibility on us, people who live in developed countries? Because there is a lot of talk in finance, and I get it. I'm happy for people to make a buck. I don't care about that. If we can make the transition, people make money, that's good, because we need large amounts of money. But how are we going to support people in communities? Because if you're a politician, it's very hard to say, for example, you're getting out of coal without thinking about jobs, because you can't just go to the renewable piece and assume everyone in that community is going to be working in a renewable job at the same remuneration, and it's going to be great, and the community is going to be taken care of. Sometimes renewables in a totally different part with less jobs. So I don't know whether we probably didn't talk about this for my team ahead of time, but I do think that that's a piece, because I know a lot of young people, when I talk to them, they're very interested in how do we focus on real people and the transition, because it won't happen without, the support of regular people believing that it's going to be better for them. So I don't know who wants to start. Anyone is welcome. Yeah.
Sure, I'll kind of touch on this. I'm actually currently working with a particular group that's funded by some of the philanthropies here in New York to basically tackle just transition. And a big part of the thinking is really around expanding the frame by which we look at the just transition. Because when that language was initially put in the climate accord, in many respects, it was the coal protection, the coal jobs that were being protected. It was the coal communities and the coal politics that saw that this could be a great risk and there was a need to actually protect those jobs. But what we realize is that beyond coal, there are many countries that depend on other forms of fossil fuels. So you have lots of oil and gas countries that their jobs may not be tied to oil and gas, but their macroeconomic stability is absolutely tied to the fossil fuel sector. And it's so much more intricate if you look along the lines of industrialization and the need to actually build high intensive cement-based development, if you will. So the just transition is so much more significant. And if anything, it's become so acute in the context of the security challenges in Ukraine, because ultimately it's poverty that is going to be the greatest challenge to climate action. Because if people aren't able to see that opportunity, and if people feel threatened and jobs are threatened, then we will stall. And I think that's what we're trying to do right now, is to really focus to support the countries that are going to have to deal with coal transition and to also broaden it. Now, in respect to coal transition, you may be familiar that South Africa has a significant intervention program, about $8.5 billion. That's basically a G2G intervention to transition off coal. Now, one of the challenges with transition for Africa is how and from where. And so for South Africa, the how is a big deal because gas is likely on that pathway. And so the need for South Africans to think about what is a way to use gas, but for that gas to have a shorter payback. Can it involve some sort of retrofitting for hydrogen? Because it's going to be very difficult to handle the transition straight from coal to alternative sources. In countries like Nigeria, Nigeria has actually done a deep piece of work into their transition, calculated it to be $400 billion, the cost of their transition. If they're to reach net zero by they're looking at 2060. Yeah, they're looking at 2060. And I mean, the reality is that, you know, the cost that is going to take a country like Nigeria, and this is actually what's very interesting about many African countries. As you've all heard, Africa contributes only 3% to global emissions. Without South Africa and Egypt, it's 0.55%. So we're not really transitioning from much. The issue is that we are going to be one of the fastest growing economies, and industrialization is going to be fundamental to that growth. So how we grow and how we transition is going to be so important and needs to be figured out. And it's very important that jobs are central to how we think about transition.
So, I mean, I think this is a hugely important point because people need jobs, they need electricity, but we need to tackle climate change. So if that 3% justly, in a way, goes to 98%, and we're using fossil fuels to drive that, I think we all recognize that we're going to be nowhere near our climate goals. So how do we square the circle on this? And I don't know who wants to.
I mean, I'm kind of curious for you to answer your own question because you dealt with this in Canada directly. And the truth is, I mean, the first step is to acknowledge how hard the problem is, I think, because we've been terrible at this for decades, right? That was the story of globalization. And for the last 30, 40 years, free trade, more free trade raises all boats, and there are winners and losers. And as long as the winners compensate the losers, we all end up better off from the macro standpoint. We're just really bad at the winners compensating the losers part. And we don't really have, I mean, there are good models for how one does that on a local or community basis. That's my point.
No, they don't actually ever do it. Now, I think some of these transitions, several points. First, we have been through them before. The whole of Wales, for example, in the United Kingdom, I think would have some very interesting experiences in shutting down the coal industry. And of course, transitions in things like textiles in the past, all sorts of things. Everybody says, well, you know, people retool themselves and it works. It doesn't. And I think one of the things that this will do is simply slow down transitions. I think we have to first take them step by step rather than do them as quickly as some people would want to have them done. I think people are as important as the energy content that we're dealing with. So I think it is a great care. Let me, if I may, add this. It seems to me at the moment, if I look at contemporary preoccupation, we have, I think, a very interesting confluence of things, one of which is the affordability of energy to normal households. And I think people have put that to one side and said that's really not a problem for rich nations. It's a problem for poor nations. Actually, it's a problem for rich nations now. So interventions are needed in order to create the sense, I think, that governments really care about what people are going to do with high energy prices. They, I think, are some diagnosing this as a real problem, and we don't want to do it. We don't want to add further problems to our problems by transitioning to green energy. It will be even more expensive. So I think we're having another debate here that needs to be solved by probably price controls, interventions of a variety of sorts that at least will take us over a period while energy security, lack of supply, primarily as a result of in the Russia-Ukraine conflict and Russia's supplies being cut off. We have to get through that period. Otherwise, I think we come through the end of it with people all over the world wondering, you know, well, why people aren't taking care of us when it comes to energy.
I just had, oh, sorry, I thought you were done. Go ahead.
I'm finished.
I was just going to add one quick thought, and then I do want Catherine you to comment on your question. But I think Lord Brown's point about energy security is critically important because there are near-term actions that have to be taken in Europe to deal with this winter, next. We all understand that, I think. But in the longer term, many of the things that enhance energy security can also point in a lower carbon direction. There's a lot of overlap, but not entire. And so if you're concerned about increased or concerned about dependence on globally traded oil and gas, inevitably exposed to some element of geopolitical risk, many countries are import dependent. For many, it's not just renewables, but they will see coal as an energy security alternative. And if you're concerned with energy security, there's a risk that coal is part of that solution set. So we need to talk about that as well.
But isn't that the point about, when you're in a crisis or a panic, you grab everything.
Sure.
And in the rush to get something done, you do the wrong thing. I think that's almost a way of life, I'd say.
So I might have a different take on this. Maybe I'm channeling the Secretary General, so he's tasked us with this. We would be in a very different spot if 20 years ago we made very different decisions. And of course, that's easy to say. I mean, we always say this. I think the concern is a couple things. So one, actually on my task force, I can't speak for Africa. I'm not African, Canadian. But the African members actually have raised concerns in the sense that in many of the places, so what's happening now, and there are uncomfortable truths, but the energy that's being potentially developed in Africa, and some of the energy that's there now is being diverted for energy poverty in Europe, which is at 30%. So that is obviously a huge issue. While energy poverty in Africa, does anyone know? 80%, maybe. So I think that and I will also say an uncomfortable truth. Fossil fuel companies have never made more money, not because they've become better at doing something, but because of an illegal war. So I think uncomfortable truths are important because the problem is it's easy to say things and it's hard to do things. And so, I mean, my view on life is, of course, you have to think about people. We brought in a price on pollution in Canada. We gave it all back. So actually, it was progressive because if you were lower income, you would get more money back. And so you always have to think about this. But my concern always is that we lurch from crisis to crisis, but we don't treat climate like the crisis it is in a way. And that goes back to when I talk to my members, I say, well, what should we be doing for Africa? And of course they say, well, it's really rich for you to say, get out of oil, get out of oil, gas, and coal when you're not giving us any money. So that goes back to the start of this conversation that we're very fortunate in developed countries. Like, yes, energy poverty is a huge issue. I don't know, maybe there is windfall taxes have a place. We often still get asked for subsidies. In Canada, we put huge subsidy in CCUS and we're told in a galling way that that was not enough money for the fossil fuel companies to actually reduce, to actually invest in CCUS. So I think that I think that the hard things are hard. I don't think they're easy answers, but I think that if we don't get the money going, of course, folks in Africa are going to say this is bizarre. But we have to get the money flowing, and we have to actually treat climate the same way we treated COVID. Now, there was inequalities. So of course, there are huge inequalities, but we never thought we could actually tackle COVID. Remember this, we weren't going to get a vaccine. I remember day 2 in cabinet, we were like, oh God, we're screwed. Like that was really it. Like we're never going to get out of it. And we spent quantums of money. We all worked together. We totally did things in government we didn't think we could do. And we recognized the cost of inaction was costing us every single day so much money. And I just encourage us, and I don't know how to do more, right? Like I gave up my job in politics to just focus on climate. But I do think it's incumbent on developed countries, and as you said, to look at financing differently, like to really dig deep, to not just sit and say the same things over and over again and try the same solutions. So I'm just a moderator on this, but I'm someone who does believe that we have to call some things out And then we have to do more work. But we always, and this is where I think we would all agree, we always have to get people at the heart of it. But I'm not sure that just developing more oil and gas and coal is actually keeping people at the heart of the solution. I don't know, we have some questions. Are we taking questions? I'm not sure. I'm very bad about whether.
I believe there's a microphone in the room. And we
We don't have a lot of time, so apologies. If you do a question, it cannot be a statement. It can be a question. We have two here. Maybe we can do this really quickly. Maybe take two, but it has to be really quick. You have to promise me. You have to look me in the eye. As I say to my children, look me in the eye.
You realize a sophisticated question can't be quick. If you wanted to see an example, you would go to Narendra Modi, who was the first prime minister or president in history to stand up in front of his country and say shit is a national crisis. And it's the first country that made any progress on reaching scale relative to that problem ever. And if you go look at what happened in that country, universities stopped studying what other people were doing. More than a dozen of them went out and got their hands dirty, actually worked on the ground with the people. They'd be designing, for example, a solution to tidal energy in Wales, which is the second largest tidal source in the world. And it's just sitting there. Governments would be giving contracts not to the low-cost producer, but to the producer who gave a decent price and created the most jobs. And those jobs would be determined by deploying a significant percentage of the new energy to specific activities contract awarded by the government, so that they could then go get capital for the rest of the work to be done beyond those specific activities. And the government could do that tomorrow. Any government anywhere in the world could make that change tomorrow. I'm sorry, it wasn't a question.
That's good. Everyone has to have an oh shit moment. That's good. And then actually do things and look at things differently and look at what are your outcomes you're trying to get. And if the way you're doing things doesn't work, you got to try something new. I think that's good. Any questions here? There are questions. Okay. We'll do the two in a row.
Thank you so much. I have two questions. And I just want to say, I hope that we don't treat climate as COVID, because we really didn't treat COVID very well. So one is, so Jason, you say it's going to be a bumpy road. I'm wondering, where do you see political momentum to smooth that bumpy road ahead? Because we admire the problem, but I'm sort of, what's out there that you see, like the CAF review, or like, freeing up SDRs, like where do you see money for that smoothing out coming from that we can boost? And another question for you, Catherine, which is, what do you expect from the expert group recommendations to come out? Is it just going to be, this is what a net zero looks like, or is it going to be, this is what we need to do to hold greenwashers accountable? Over.
And then we actually have this young woman here. Just go for it.
So there's been a lot of talk about the need to finance and the need for innovations in finance. And I'm just curious if you're aware of some of those innovations, something we can look at. Like, are we talking about new financial instruments like SPACs? And then there are risks associated with that. So, so I'm just curious kind of what we're looking at there, especially because I'm interested in that field possibly.
Good question.
So I think that we have 5 minutes. Is that right? Okay, maybe like 6 minutes. But what we'll do is, I think for the interest of time, we'll just go through. Do we want to just each take a run at that?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and I want to hear Taria and Lord Brown's answer to it, because they're putting capital to work every day. And what Catherine said about, we just have to put the money to work. And the problem is, like, the amount of capital that's needed, there's just not enough government capital. This is going to be private capital. And so really digging into a hard question of what is going to unlock the barriers to putting that work. Where do bankable projects come from? Do we have the human capital, human talent pipeline to do renewable project development in a way that creates financeable projects? All of those are like critical questions that I think we're going to hear about in a second, but focusing on the private capital to your question. And I do think there's growing recognition, but we sort of need to think harder about what the bumps in the road will look like. Some of them are political economy challenges that Catherine was talking about, to think about how to smooth the disruptions that people will see in terms of which communities win and which lose economically. The need for Ursula von der Leyen this week was announcing emergency measures, but then saying we need to think about how to restructure Europe's electricity markets moving forward for issues of security and reliability as you transition to a very different kind of energy system. You see countries thinking differently about their strategic reserves, their stockpiles, about where security of supply comes from and how diversification fits into that. So I think there are a number of steps that governments are starting to think about because this crisis is changing the way we're all thinking about security of supply and diversification. But we actually need to think a little harder about not only the geopolitical risks that will be mitigated, not to mention the climate risks from a transition to clean energy, but some of the bumps along the way economically and geopolitically, because again, we can't have a transition if we don't smooth those.
I think we have to be careful about thinking that finance in its pure self will solve all the problems. I do think that a lot's been tried, more can be tried by dividing risks into different packages so that people with different risk appetites can take different bits of the problem. And you can see that with people creating warrants and options as well as underlying activity. There are plenty of ways of doing this and very much, I think, focused on case by case to an extent here. So I think that's really important for people to think about. I really don't think it's going to be the only solution.
If I can just add on the finance point, that underpinning finance is actually the business models, because you tailor the finance to the underlying business model. And so and part of the climate solutions are going to be around innovations in business model and evolution in business models. And a classic case for both of us, and as you're probably seeing, is decentralized energy, decentralized infrastructure that's being done sort of with a bit more commercial risk. So infrastructure that isn't as blue chip and structured as we would all like, but to be able to make that impact, we have to be able to be open to new business models. And that means finance has to be able to tailor to that. And so within that, then you can start looking at, then designing the instrument is relatively easy. The question is just, can you actually convince the financial institutions to go through that learning process to learn and to master a new instrument? Because the framework involves the CIOs, it involves certain sorts of decision makers. And so if the business models become too bespoke, then the financial solutions are too bespoke and we can't scale. So we need to get to a point where we also have business models that start being in certain forms of verticals. So we can start studying them, creating a financial instrument, and we can throw out all kinds of financial instruments. But if it takes 5 years to convince an investor to get comfortable with it, then that's just 5 years too long from the type of emergency that we're dealing with.
Let me just put a finer point on the answer I gave a moment ago. I just want to I gave a lot of in the week examples, but when you bring them all together, I think the fundamental point about that idea of smoothing the transition, the dislocated communities, comes back to where Catherine started, which is what a just transition looks like. And the transition has to be just, not only to avoid being unjust, but because it's not going to happen otherwise. Yeah. So if we actually want to have the kind of transition at the scale and speed we need, the idea of thinking about what a just transition looks like is central. Otherwise, we're not going to maintain support economically, politically for the kind of direction we have to go in.
Mm-hmm.
So on the innovative finance, so Canada created I was in the cabinet of Justin Trudeau, and we created an infrastructure bank, a sustainable infrastructure bank. And the whole point was actually to leverage private sector dollars to get more infrastructure built. Now, it didn't work at first because they were competing with the private sector. And I was like, you know what? I actually don't care about your rate of return. Get your money back, but get things built that wouldn't get built, including solve problems like Indigenous communities, getting them off of diesel and working on them opportunities. So that's an interesting model. Have a look at it. So the report is, so it's going to be released by the Secretary General. We're providing it to him in advance of COP. It's very functional. like, as I say, emissions really only go up or down, and the money either goes to clean or continues the status quo. And so that's what net zero we're looking at. Like, if you make a net zero commitment, which is great, 90% of the planet has a net zero commitment of GDP is covered by net zero. That's the amazing part. The bad part, emissions are still going up and money is still going to add scale to fossil fuels, not to clean. So it's really, do you have a target? Do you have an interim target? Where's your money going? Are your emissions going down? It's very functional things. But to the gentleman's point, and I'll just end on that. I mean, look, there are limits, and putting all the pressure on the private sector and financial institutions, on corporates, at the end of the day, you need government. Government has to come in. So that's where we're looking at, how do you regulate these, all of the different pieces, because that helps from a competitiveness perspective, but it also means that you can get this virtuous cycle where you have government working with corporates, financial institutions to really get things done. So stay tuned. It's going to come out sometime at COP27. I think that we're done.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks very much.
Keen to get to the
Okay, so
drink stand.
what's that?
So they'll be keen to get to the reception now.
Yes. Okay, we ready? Presto changeo. We start with a second panel. If I could just get everybody's attention, please have your seats. Take your seats, please, and we'll get started with the second panel. So my name is John Elkind. I'm a senior research scholar here at the Center on Global Energy Policy, and we continue our conversation on mobilizing finance, global perspective, with four excellent additional experts who have a lot to contribute. On my far left is Diana Fox-Carney, who is an advisor to the BeyondNetZero team. She also is senior advisor at Eurasia Group, where she advises clients on environmental issues and climate transition. Next to me is Jake Levine, who is the chief climate officer with the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation. He heads the climate team there at DFC and is responsible for setting the vision and implementing that climate finance agenda. To my right is Leonardo Beltran Rodriguez, who is a distinguished visiting fellow at the Center on Global Energy Policy here at Columbia. He served previously in the government of Mexico as the Deputy Secretary of Energy, where he played a critical role in the design and implementation of Mexico's historic energy reforms under the previous Mexican administration. And to his right, last but not least, is Anish Tucker, who is the co-founder of Sun King, co-founder of Greenlight Planet, now Sun King, if I understand correctly, a social enterprise that focuses on manufacturing and mass grassroots distribution of long-lasting and ultra-affordable solar lights for rural families. So there was a fabulous setup that Tarja used in her remarks in the last panel that provides the thread that I hope that this discussion now will really pull on a great deal. She said, poverty is the greatest threat to climate action. So if we are here for the purpose of trying to bring some global perspectives to the business of accelerating and scaling up climate finance, then what does that look like? How do we take on simultaneously in a period where there are huge uncertainties across global markets, where countries are struggling to afford their import bills for today's economy, and they are struggling to get decarbonized energy in place for the future so that we can move ahead in a way that will not break the climate bank, so to speak. In this session, we hope really to drill into practical solutions. And I am very emphatically using the plural there because represented in this group are many different practical solutions, from those that apply very much for distributed energy to those that are targeting some of the most difficult and persistent challenges around currency exchange rate risk. My colleague Leonardo will speak to that some, to those that are trying to figure out how governmental institutions can partner with and can crowd in private finance in the most effective way possible. So we've got a great set of people in front of you. And Diana, let me ask you, if you wouldn't mind, please, to kick us off a little bit with thoughts about how you see the field of play to develop the full range of different financial interventions that are needed, the solutions that we were talking about in the last panel as well. Over to you, please.
Thank you very much. I think, I'm kind of a living, breathing example of why we should be a bit optimistic in this space. And that's because I worked most of my life in...
No t-shirt on you.
I haven't got a t-shirt. I'm there with Catherine, but I worked most of my life. I worked in Africa on agriculture. I worked in climate. I worked in think tanks. I worked in things that nobody cared about. I now work for two major private equity funds, one of which invests exclusively in Africa, and one which invests globally and has made a major investment in Africa. It's not to say that it's simple, but people care, and money is flowing into this space. There is no doubt. It's not at the scale and that we need, and there are some problems, and we can easily get into the problems. But solutions. So people are thinking about it. As you will know, many banks, financial institutions have made huge pledges around net zero. Catherine's trying to figure out what that means. But in the meantime, they need to make investments that are unequivocally good for their portfolio in terms of demonstrating their commitment to, or demonstrating that they will move towards net zero. So there is progress in that front. The carbon credit market, which hasn't been talked about much, is tiny now. It gets a lot of bad press, but it also should get a lot of good press because it is one way of pulling in a lot of money into developing countries. New commitments are about $1 billion last year. That could scale to 150, 500 billion. All of that will go into developing economies, but a good portion will, and that will help to make viable some of these projects that were not previously viable. And it has to be done right, unquestionably, and there's some jeopardy around it, but it is a way of getting money in and making these things bankable. The third point is that a lot of the technologies are ready. They are, deployable now. You can make money now. As you all know, the price of solar panels, battery packs, everything has gone down. Those are ready for not all of them are ready, but they're getting ready for developing economies. EVs are penetrating these places, and firms like the one that I invest in that I'm part of are ready to invest in those solutions. And we have commitments around, what are called JETPs, Just Energy Transition Partnerships, which are large-scale programs in a number of developing countries. There isn't enough substance on those, and I think success will breed success. And at the moment, we're slightly floundering around in the details of those, and we could get into that later on. So there are many challenges. There are challenges around exchange rates and other things. There are challenges around the returns that the institutions like Jake's wish to see from organizations like my own in order to put money there. And many things that we need to get over and find new sort of approaches to doing. But I think if we see climate as a lever for creating value in the private sector, then we're on the right path.
Well, and I particularly latch on to your point, which I think is very important to keep in mind, is that success can breed success. So let's build those first successes. Jake, if you wouldn't mind, talk a little bit about how the Development Finance Corporation, and perhaps in partnership with other development finance institutions, is thinking about the need for solutions in this space, the need for solutions in particular that help to bring down the costs of clean energy in the developing world. Please.
Sure. Thank you, John. And thanks, Jason and Catherine and Columbia, for hosting this. This talk is wonderful, and it's nice to see a packed room. For those of you who may not know, I think DFC is the best kept secret in the US government. So I won't blame you if you've never heard of us. We are the US Development Bank. We have an authorization from Congress to invest up to $60 billion in developing countries around the world. And we've so far deployed about half of that. Last year, we had our biggest year ever. We did about close to $7 billion of new commitments. I hope, fingers crossed, that we will do that again this year and continue sort of the upward trajectory. And we've made an enormous commitment to climate, where we've committed to be net zero by 2040. Catherine, we can talk about what that means. And we've committed to investing at least 1/3 of our financing in climate aligned projects. Now, this question of costs is critical. And I just want to share a few numbers that came up in meetings today. One of the things that's awesome about UNGA and Climate Week coinciding is that you get a chance to hear firsthand from the governments all in one place who we're working with. Tomorrow night, we're meeting with the leaders from Pakistan. Wednesday, we're going to see the president of Malawi and the coordinating minister from Indonesia. And I raise these three jurisdictions specifically because, as everyone here is well aware, Pakistan has just seen maybe one of the most devastating climate impacts that we've witnessed. Record rains, glacial melt that has displaced 33 million people. If they don't see floodwaters recede in the next week or two, they could miss an entire harvest in terms of production of food. In Malawi, you may be less familiar, they're dealing with a record drought and then a cyclone, which reduced maize production by 19%. At the same time, Malawi saw an annual year-over-year rate of inflation of 19%. In Indonesia, the seawater is rising. You've got Jakarta, which is sinking, saltwater intrusion, real resilience adaptation problems. And we are participating in this Just Energy Transition Partnership in large part to funnel more cash into adaptation projects in places like Jakarta so that they can withstand these impacts. But I heard a shocking statistic today from a pension fund that we want to do business with. Part of our goal is to crowd in institutional investors to bring pension funds, big banks, private equity, the private sector into transactions that the capital markets can come into play. this is a pension fund that has a $400 billion balance sheet. They invest $60 billion in emerging markets. And out of that $60 billion, they can just take 15% right off the top on foreign exchange risk that they lose simply by converting currency. Heard a similar story from a company that had investment from the Acumen Fund. So looking at this now at the firm level, a company that has allocated 20% of its revenue to payments for mitigation of foreign exchange risk. So now those are some of the challenges, solutions. I will just tick off a few categories because I hope we can get into more detail and I don't want to monopolize the mic. But I think 3 areas where we're seeing really great traction. Number 1, in project preparation, we have a climate action facility, which is designed to create bankable projects. Because as many of you know, 90% of projects die on the vine before they ever get to investment. And we believe that by providing low cost and in some cases grant financing to help in the pre-development stage, we can get that project from zero to investment. Secondly, we have a political risk insurance tool which protects against political risks, expropriation, currency risks, that helps the private sector gain some comfort into investing in markets where there are high risks, and that helps us mobilize capital at scale. And then finally, I think that the role of the guarantee is really important and something that should be getting a lot more play. We have a guarantee product. We're working on increasing it because right now we only provide partial guarantees. But if we can get our guarantee from 75% to 100%, again, we think we can mobilize capital. We actually did, I'm looking at Jorge in the audience at Citi, we supported $350 million in our last quarter of a guarantee as part of the Citi social finance commitment. That's going to finance hundreds of millions of dollars more in projects for small and medium enterprises around the world. And we need that kind of innovation to bring more private capital off the sidelines.
Excellent. 3 very specific solutions that DFC is using. Let's take a really different look now from the perspective of Anish Tucker and Sun King. You are obviously, you're working with a very different piece of the energy economy and the countries that you are targeting. Tell us a little bit about the solutions that you are finding to be effective and where you aim to go.
Sure. So Sun King is the largest provider of solar power to homes that live off the reliable electric grid. Today, 90 million people use Sun King for power on a daily basis, including 1 in 5 Kenyan households. It's 20% of the households in Kenya. I come at some optimism, and that's that, when we think about the green transition in the West, we think about something that's coming in the future. Rooftop solar in the US, about 3 million houses have rooftop solar. That's about 3% of households in the US. But in Kenya, where we've been active the longest, in sub-Saharan Africa, it's 20% of households. 1 in 5 households are using Sun King for power on a daily basis. And okay, so why is that? In part because there's been more than 100 years and billions of dollars of investment to build centralized grid infrastructure, right? So trying to move that sounds like a very hard problem. The situation for more than 1 billion people that live mostly in sub-Saharan Africa, but in other parts of the world, is that the grid never showed up, right? So we get to start from scratch and build solutions that are not only green, but are just, right? So what Sun King does is we enable homes to be able to afford their own solar power on their own roof. They can generate power for their own house. They're not dependent on whether the grid's working, whether the grid showed up to their house, whether it's going to come in 10, 20, or 30 years. They can invest in solar today. The purchase financing is so essential. A solar kit that costs about $200 will provide sort of basic needs: lighting, small appliance power, enough solar and battery storage for that, to our largest systems, which are a few $1,000s. And you get enough solar power and battery storage that you can power, it's not enough power of a small apartment in the West, or a whole large house in most of the countries we operate in. But being able to, and these things pay for themselves from savings on kerosene or savings on gas that goes into a genset that's running and creating fumes in the backyard. They pay for themselves in 1 or 2 or 3 years, but without the ability to finance that purchase. Asking a home to basically pay their next 3 years of energy bills up front. Without that purchase financing, this is impossible. So we building that purchase infrastructure to provide pay-as-you-go financing is a big part of what we do. Today, we've connected 4 million households with pay-as-you-go finance solar. We've extended $500 million of purchase financing and put 30 megawatts of solar power on those roofs. At our current rates, we connect 2 million houses every year. We had 25 megawatts of solar power every year. So, there's some optimism there, but, conservatively, there's 250 million households that need this stuff. So, the math on this is it's something like $50 to $100 billion of largely commercial sector capital that needs to come into this space to be able to extend financing for all off-grid homes everywhere.
Anish, will you say just another layer down for those who are not familiar with pay-as-you-go financing? How does it work? Why is it essential to the target audience, the customers you're dealing with?
So, okay, in the US, we walk in a room, we flip a light switch and the power just works, right? But for more than 1 billion people, there's no electrical grid that connects the house, or the grid's off for 23 hours a day. So there's no power. And so what homes often have to do is they have to burn kerosene for light. These are people that are just like you and me. They have kids, they're trying to put them to bed, they're trying to get the kids to study, but they have to spend literally every minute, they have to burn their income on kerosene to power a lamp to provide light for study. And it affects the productive time in the house, it affects education in a big way. But solar is truly affordable today. So what pay-as-you-go financing does is allows customers to escape this issue of the big upfront cost. So today we have 15,000 field staff in 7 countries in Africa, and they go door to door. They explain solar power. They help customers apply for purchase financing. If a customer buys solar from us, they install it on the roof, and then the customer pays for solar 1 week at a time. From the savings that they're enjoying because they're not spending on kerosene or on gas for a genset, and they're paying off that asset 1 week at a time, and they're paying it off over 1 or 2 or 3 years.
Great. And our last come to you, I alluded to the currency exchange rate risk coverage effort that we have underway. You bring to this conversation a rich experience from your work in Mexico, both in government and also as a consequence of that, serving on the board of 2 of Mexico's the 2 largest energy sectors, Pemex and CFE. Tell us a little bit about that, the work in relation to currency exchange rate risks, please.
Thank you, John, and thanks very much for the opportunity to be here. Thank you. It's a fantastic opportunity, Jason, to be part of this panel. Let me give you a piece of data. In terms of depreciation, Mexico, in the last couple of years, the Mexican peso depreciated 9%. And
against the dollar.
Against the dollar, yes, the US dollar. So for the national utility, CFE, that represented $2.5 billion for covering their debt. And the last result of the company was with a financial on red numbers. So, and just because of the depreciation, something that happened to the peso outside of the control of the utility, no? So not enough resources to actually invest in developing new power projects to extend the national grid, to service more communities, to nothing, just to pay its own debt. And that's the 15th largest economy. So if we go and talk to Malawi, or we talk to Nicaragua, or if we talk to Sudan, well, the problem is there's no coverage to actually go and invest in a project in those regions. And actually, we were thinking hard, and a colleague of ours, Philip Benoit, also from the Center on Global Energy Policy, along with a couple of people from the World Bank and the World Economic Forum, start thinking on uses of climate finance. And in particular, using that climate finance to actually cover the exchange rate depreciation. It's something that have not been discussed previously. So today we are in the process of having a large conversation with different stakeholders, including the FIC. And the idea is basically for any project developer anywhere in the world to devote a certain amount of the clean energy certificates, the clean energy bonds, the climate bonds that would be accurate to their particular project, to dedicate that to cover the exchange rate risk. And then we have a blended finance composition for that particular project. But basically, the idea is to invest for every $1.5 you invest, you would be leveraging around 13 additional US dollars of investments and actually covering for the exchange rate risk. So in other words, today, if you would like to invest, let's say in India, it would cost you double of what would be required to invest here, because of the different risks reflected into that jurisdiction. But a large portion of those risks are because of the exchange rate risk. So with this concept, with this idea, actually it would be covered that risk, certainly not eliminated, because that's some outside of the realm of the particular instrument. But it will cover the entire risk, which if you are CFE of Benin, it would be a fantastic opportunity to release some resources and actually deploy and extend the grid or service new communities. So maybe it would be worthwhile to take a look at this portion that would be, it's forthcoming in the next few days. Probably John can speak a little bit more about that. But it's an interesting destiny of climate finance that has not been discussed. And if you were asking about innovative mechanisms to scale up the energy transition and to make it happen, maybe this is one concept that we should be paying attention.
So thank you for that. And indeed, we hope to have some written presentation of the idea that Leonardo was just summarizing coming out from the Center on Global Energy Policy in the coming period. So please stay tuned for that. I want to ask a question. I mean, in general, as I've said to the panelists who are here, I hope that they will each play the role of provocateur to the greatest extent that they wish and get into debates and discussions with each other. But we've been talking about the need for capital. We've been talking about some of the tensions around poverty and the need to develop energy systems that can in turn fuel economic development broadly and translate into job creation, et cetera. Are there tensions, in your view, between the profit making goals of financiers? Guess what? People that do finance are interested in returns. Between that and the climate and energy development objectives. Want to be the first go at that?
I mean, it is uncomfortable at times thinking that you're investing to make money in a very poor country that's going to be brought back to people, to pension funds, etc. here. On the other hand, you're not going to get their money if you don't make, if you don't make a return, they're not going to put their money in. So it's something one has to be comfortable with the idea that the way to mobilize money is to create a return. But the level of that return, and as described, if that's going to be completely kind of demolished by currency fluctuations, that's a huge problem. There's other things that kind of challenge those returns. Things like, if you're in private equity, how are you going to exit these investments? It's extremely hard. It's not obvious how this happens in Africa specifically. Unlike, there's many more options, let's put it that way, in developed countries. But, I think it is soluble to some degree. But the kinds of things that Jake was talking about, the kind of helping hands that can get us there, and ideally identifying, some funders who don't want the top level of return, that helps. And that helps kind of, de-risk it for others, I would say.
Yeah, but I think I'll just add a couple things, because, these economies that we're talking about, these are also the places in the world where you're seeing the fastest rate of GDP growth, the fastest rate of population growth. These are the youngest places on the planet. So there's tremendous innovation, there's hustle, there's energy, there's entrepreneurship.
And local capital, right?
And there's local capital. And so I think one of the issues that we work to try to sort of demystify a little bit is the perception of risk, because that is holding people back from investing and making money. And perceived risk does not frequently translate to actual risk. And I think that one of the things I'm really excited about is the way that we are now seeing data increasingly that bears this out. We just did a really interesting transaction in Egypt, where we issued a green note in the amount of $50 million in a refinancing of a solar park called the Benban Solar Facility. It's a massive solar park that's now a model for all types of clean energy, from wind to green hydrogen to electric vehicles. And in this refinancing, we were able to take out other DFIs and other MDBs and bring in a Korean pension fund and a Japanese pension fund who said, we want a piece of this Egyptian risk because we're seeing great returns. Now, this is a good project, and it was creating steady, stable, good revenue from the Egyptian grid. But I think that, somebody, I think maybe Jason mentioned in the last panel, that you sort of need all these things to come together. And when you have these comprehensive solutions and a good project with good returns and steady patient capital, you end up with excellent returns, even in an economy like Egypt. But to the last point, we have these sweeteners, like we have concessional finance to help bring the projects along that aren't quite there yet, to provide low-cost capital so that the private sector can come in and help build to maturity down the line.
And let me ask you this. I mean, DFC is in these clean energy projects all the time, I would assume, is encountering the particular sets of challenges that come from modest returns, kind of utility scale, utility rate of returns, local currency denominated revenues, and for the infrastructure projects, long tenors. So it's not a 5-year note that's going to get you through to the end of the financing. So to what extent is that an obstacle for a DFC, or is it, as you just described, bringing in pension funds that want that exposure? Is that not a bug but a feature?
Well, it's it's kind of both. I mean, it's both an obstacle and a big opportunity. But this is where I think this is why I mentioned the political risk insurance and the guarantee, because one of the things that has the ability to do is to raise the rating of the capital. So you can take what would sort of have been in the status quo a triple B minus financing, and you can sort of automatically bump that up with a US government backed, or really any MDB, DFI backed guarantee or insurance, and bring that up to a triple B plus, an A rating that it automatically reduces the cost of capital. And so instead of looking at a 2-year tenor, 16% financing, which is not bankable, you're looking at a 10-year tenor, 6%, which suddenly becomes highly attractive to the private market. So there are these mechanisms that can unlock that. And I think, to your initial question, that mechanism doesn't always work because there might not be the offtake or the construction risk. There are reasons why that doesn't work, but there are also opportunities to make that work. And we're trying to find those opportunities and create models. And then I think, as you said earlier, success breeds success.
That wasn't my wording. That was Diana's.
Oh, that was Diana's. Sorry.
I'm
attributing you.
Well, okay. So I get, again, I hope that you all will start to jump in and without waiting for politely for my questions to you. But Anish, let me ask you this. Could you comment a little bit on, you highlighted the importance of the finance to enable that pay-as-you-go model to work. Are there tensions around, who wants to see exits, who wants to see returns out of your investor community, or how do you manage those tensions or that interplay?
Yeah, I mean, I would say I think that the biggest focus for us is how to turn this into the most boring thing to finance in the world. That's what this should be about, right? Innovation is great. Doing something new and different for the first time is great. And there has to be capital for that. That's where the venture capital or the private equity often comes in. But at the end, if we're going to get our job done, which is getting solar on the roofs of 250 million houses, we have to crowd in capital that wants boring investments. We think about this kind of like how homes are financed in the US. But before the 30-year mortgage, homes weren't the vehicle for financial stability and progress that they are today, right? But what a part of what got it there is pretty boring ways to finance lots and lots of consumer receivables in housing finance. So I think we think about off-grid solar receivables financing in the same way. The key is, how do we finance this? How do we make sure this is predictable and bankable so that commercial capital can come in? And we're starting to see that. We've raised $400 million in the last few years from large private equity funds, but also from commercial banks like Citibank and Stanbic. And so that's starting. There are these challenges that are very different. The 30-year mortgage is based on a credit score. It's based on decades and decades of cohorts of results that are predictable. This is new. And we're talking about consumers who are, by and large, don't have a bank account, don't have a credit history. So, some of this has to be built, and has to be built pretty fast. But I think that's where some of these, and then there's the currency risk, of course, and country risk, and all these other elements. But I think that's where we have to stitch all these pieces together. The other is public sector capital. We're starting to see that coming into the space in a big way. The $250 million Nigerian electrification project is incredibly successful. This is accelerating the adoption of rooftop solar home systems in Nigeria. In our own example, 3 years ago, we were connecting about 2,000 households a month. Now we're connecting 60,000 households a month. We're putting 1 megawatt of solar power on roofs every single month in Nigeria. And the World Bank has announced, that program, by the way, is funded by the World Bank and the FCB. And the World Bank has announced $2 billion of funding for similar programs in other countries. So that's one component of this. But I think we have to stitch together all these pieces. At the end, this has to look like the most boring, predictable, bankable asset to fund for commercial banks.
We aspire to be boring. Okay, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I wanted to jump in because, again, from an experience in Mexico, 60% of the working age population, it's informal. So if you actually want to access to any kind of finance, it's really hard. There's no information, there's no infrastructure, and that's, again, Mexico, the top 15 economy worldwide. So, actually these type of mechanisms are really useful to actually in aggregating different small demand, actually make it viable for scaling that up. And I think it's a fantastic way to actually bring these services to underserved communities. So probably part of the challenge is thinking about scale, but at the same structural architecture that we have in a developed country. So probably we should be aiming at thinking in decentralization and these different business models that are not based in a large scale if we are actually to reach and incorporate these developing economies.
So we have, I want to remind everybody, a reception that will be taking place after this program ends. We're doing something that's highly unusual for our programs at the Center on Global Energy Policy and running a little bit overtime. We almost never do that. But I remind you, the reception will be upstairs. So we view this as a conversation that is primed to continue when we go upstairs. I want to ask my four panelists if they have parting shots, and Diana, you clearly do. And so I invite you to kick us off again, please.
So two brief things, slightly unrelated. One is, I think a positive thing that is worth mentioning is if we can get many of these countries off so much importing so much oil and petroleum products, that is a huge help for their currencies, basically. I mean, places like Nigeria spend between 25 and 40% of their foreign exchange on importing oil, even though it's a huge oil producer, it doesn't refine. That's a huge problem for the country. So ideally move off that, do renewables, it looks better. Second point that I just think we haven't talked about, you mentioned, was adaptation. I mean, it's not status quo in these places. And the part of the problem is that, the kind of baseline is going down. So you also need money to support people to ensure that they are able to, pay as you go, solar, etc. And I think that is a more challenging space. It's more challenging for the private sector you can invest in adaptation, but I think people don't understand how far, the private sector, no one really understands how much of that money can come from the private sector to support adaptation to the ravages of climate, which are being seen most strongly in Africa.
Great, thank you. Parting shots, Jake.
I think I just suppose I would sort of underline that point because I think Terrier kicked us off appropriately with this note on poverty. And that is sort of the organizing thesis of DFC, which is to say that we are a development finance agency. And we believe that you can't have climate resilience without economic development. And, just as a reminder, I know that we all hear these numbers, but while the United States is talking about electrify everything, which to be clear is great, there are 770 million people around the world who don't have access to electricity, so thank you, Anish, for rectifying that problem bit by bit. 77% of those people live in 23 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. So when we talk about solving this problem and having a just energy transition, we really have to remember that it's a totally different conversation for most of the world. And I suppose I just want to underscore that because I think sometimes that gets lost in translation.
Great point to underscore. Leonardo, please.
Well, I would like to give an example as well. The average wage of a Mexican, it's around $200. So if we are to electrify everything, there's no way that a Mexican can actually enter the EV market.
Thank you. Anish.
I think the last panel addressed the point that the majority of carbon emissions are from places outside of sub-Saharan Africa, because a lot of sub-Saharan Africa isn't on the grid, isn't consuming huge amounts of power. But I think one thing to keep in mind is that the aspiration for the quality of life that we in the West enjoy, that's not changed, right? It's a question of how to get there. What we've seen in a place like Nigeria is, over the last 10 years, millions and millions of gas gensets being imported. And if you leave Lagos, you'll see homes that have a grid connection for an hour and have a gas genset burning gas to generate electricity so they can power a TV, a fridge, an air conditioner. And that's going to happen more and more unless we find effective ways to bring cleaner power.
So I hope that we have succeeded to bring out in the course of this conversation some solutions that can be a part of the pathway to the finance flows that we need to see in order to achieve our decarbonization agenda, while ensuring that countries, particularly poor countries, and the people who live in them have access to the economic opportunities that we all seek. Please let me remind you as we conclude that a full video recording of this event will be available on the website of the Center on Global Energy Policy in the next couple of days. Our next event is actually taking place tomorrow as we continue our Climate Week NYC programming. That is entitled Staying the Course in a World of Turmoil. It's going to be tomorrow at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time. The program will feature Frans Timmermans, who is the Executive Vice President of the European Union and who has responsibility for the European Green Deal, among other hugely complicated tasks that are before him at this time. Columbia affiliates are welcome to join us in person at Low Library. If you are not a Columbia affiliate, we encourage you to watch online, where you will be able to see it streamed live. Everybody, please first join us upstairs for a reception right after we conclude. And please join me in thanking our 4 panelists for their excellent comments and contributions.